on a freezing February morning in 1945 as American forces pushed toward the Rhine River in the heart of Nazi Germany. A 28-year-old nurse named Margaret Sullivan stood in the ruins of a bombed-out church in the village of Jülich and made a decision that would save more than 800 American lives, because she had discovered something in the basement of that church, something the Germans had left behind. And what she did with that discovery in the next 6 hours would earn her a place among the greatest heroes of the Second World War. Even though she never fired a single bullet, Margaret had grown up in the coal mining town of Scranton, Pennsylvania, the daughter of Irish immigrants who believed that education was the path to a better life, and she had worked her way through nursing school at the University of Pennsylvania, graduating in 1938 with honors and dreams of working in the finest hospitals in Philadelphia. But then Pearl Harbor changed everything, and within 3 months, Margaret had enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps because she believed that her country needed her and because she could not sit safely at home while young men were dying overseas. She arrived in England in March 1944 as part of the massive build-up for the invasion of France, and she spent the spring training for the casualties that everyone knew were coming. And when D-Day finally arrived on June 6th, Margaret was stationed at a field hospital in southern England, receiving the wounded who were evacuated from the beaches, and she worked 18-hour shifts for weeks on end, treating wounds that no training could have prepared her for, and watching young men die, despite everything she did to save them. And she learned in those terrible weeks what war truly meant. But what happened next changed everything, because in August 1944, Margaret was transferred to a forward surgical hospital that followed the advancing American armies across France, and she found herself moving from town to town, setting up operating theaters in schools and churches and farmhouses, treating the wounded as close to the front lines as possible, because the medical corps had learned that speed saved lives, and the closer you could operate to where men were hit, the more of them would survive. And Margaret became one of the best surgical nurses in the European theater, known for her calm under fire and her ability to work through the chaos. The winter of 1945 was brutal as American forces pushed into Germany itself, fighting through the heavily fortified line and the ancient cities of the Rhineland, and Margaret's hospital followed the Ninth Army as it battled toward the industrial heartland of the Reich. And she saw things that winter that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Villages reduced to rubble, civilians starving in the ruins, German soldiers who were barely more than children sent to die for a cause that was already lost, and American boys broken by the cold and the fighting and the endless grinding advance. And then something no one expected happened, because on February 23, 1945, as American forces prepared to assault the town of Jülich, which commanded a crucial crossing over the Roe River, Margaret was sent forward with a small medical team to establish an aid station in the ruins of the town which had just been captured. And as she searched for a suitable building, she discovered the bombed-out church, and she went down into its basement looking for a dry space to set up her supplies, and what she found there changed the course of the entire battle. The basement was filled with German documents, hundreds of pages of maps and orders, and intelligence reports that had been abandoned when the German garrison fled. And Margaret could not read German, but she recognized what she was looking at because her father had served in the First War and had taught her to read military maps, and she saw immediately that these documents showed the German defensive positions along the river and the locations of artillery batteries and minefields, and the routes that German reinforcements would use. And she understood that this information could save the lives of the American soldiers who were about to attack. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because as Margaret examined the documents more closely, she found something even more valuable, which was a complete German plan for a counterattack that was scheduled for that very night, a plan that would hit the American lines at their weakest point and potentially destroy the entire battalion that was preparing to cross the river. And Margaret knew that she had perhaps 6 hours to get this information to the commanders who needed it, and that if she failed, 800 American soldiers might die. She gathered the documents and ran through the ruined streets of Jülich looking for an officer who could help her, and she found a young captain from the intelligence section, and she showed him what she had discovered, and his face went pale as he realized what he was looking at, and he said, "My God, they're going to hit us tonight, and we don't have anything in position to stop them." And Margaret said, "Then we need to get this to division headquarters right now." And the captain said, "The roads are under artillery fire, and the radio is out, and I don't have anyone I can spare." And Margaret said, "Then I'll go myself." Behind these ruins, a secret waited, because Margaret did not know that the German forces in the area had been ordered to hold Jülich at all costs, and that the withdrawal had been a tactical maneuver designed to draw the Americans forward into a trap, and the counterattack she had discovered was just one part of a larger operation that could have destroyed the American bridgehead and set back the Allied advance by weeks, and the German commanders were even now watching the American positions, waiting for the signal to attack. Margaret commandeered a jeep and a driver named Private First Class Tommy Chun from San Francisco, and they set off through the darkness toward division headquarters. 12 miles to the rear, and the roads were cratered by artillery and choked with supply convoys, and twice they had to dive into ditches when German shells exploded nearby, and Tommy asked her what was so important that they had to risk their lives driving through an artillery barrage, and Margaret showed him the documents, and Tommy said, "Holy hell, ma'am, you just saved a lot of guys," and Margaret said, "Not yet, we haven't." They reached division headquarters at 2100 hours, and Margaret burst into the command post, still covered in mud and debris from the drive, and she demanded to see the commanding general, and the staff officers looked at this disheveled nurse and tried to send her away, but Margaret refused to leave, and finally a colonel came out to see what the commotion was about, and Margaret showed him the documents and explained what she had found, and the colonel's face changed from annoyance to alarm as he realized what he was looking at. The general was awakened and briefed within 20 minutes, and orders went out immediately to reinforce the threatened sector and to reposition artillery to meet the expected attack. And at 03:00 hours, when the German counterattack came, the American forces were ready and waiting, and instead of the devastating surprise that could have destroyed a battalion, the Germans ran into a wall of fire that stopped them cold and broke their attack before it could gain momentum. And by dawn, the German forces were retreating, and the American advance continued toward the Rhine. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because when the battle was over and the intelligence staff analyzed the captured documents, they realized that Margaret had done more than save one battalion. She had uncovered the entire German defensive plan for the sector, which allowed American forces to advance with far fewer casualties than expected, and the intelligence officer said that her discovery had potentially saved thousands of lives and changed the timeline of the entire campaign. Margaret returned to her surgical hospital and continued her work, treating the wounded, who came streaming back from the front lines, and she did not think of herself as a hero because she had only done what anyone would do if they found something that could save lives, and she did not talk about what she had done because there were more pressing concerns, like the young man on the table in front of her who needed her complete attention if he was going to survive, and so the story of what she had done might have been forgotten. But the battalion commander, whose men she had saved, was a colonel named William Harrison, and he made sure that Margaret's actions were recorded and reported, and he personally recommended her for the Silver Star, which was awarded to her in a ceremony in April 1945, making her one of only a handful of women to receive that decoration during World War II, and the citation read that Lieutenant Margaret Sullivan, through exceptional initiative and courage under fire, obtained intelligence of vital importance and personally delivered it through enemy artillery fire, enabling American forces to repel a major counterattack and save hundreds of American lives. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, and Margaret continued serving in Germany, helping to establish medical facilities for displaced persons and concentration camp survivors. And she saw things in those months after liberation that were even worse than what she had seen during the fighting, because now she saw what the Nazis had done to the millions of people they had imprisoned and murdered, and she worked 16-hour days treating survivors who were more dead than alive, and she never forgot their faces or their stories. Margaret returned to the United States in December 1945, and she was greeted at the dock in New York by her parents and her 3 brothers and her childhood sweetheart who had served in the Pacific and who had written to her every week for 3 years, and they were married the following spring, and Margaret went back to nursing, working at a veterans hospital in Philadelphia, where she spent the next 30 years caring for the men who had come home broken by the wars she had witnessed. She rarely spoke about her Silver Star or about what she had done in Jülich because she felt uncomfortable with praise, and because she believed that the real heroes were the soldiers who had done the fighting and dying, and when people asked about her service, she would talk about the nurses she had worked with and the doctors who had performed miracles under impossible conditions and the medics who had risked their lives to bring wounded men back from the front lines, and she would say that she was just one small part of something much larger. The battalion she saved held reunions every year, and they always invited Margaret, and she always came, and the men who were now grandfathers would crowd around her and shake her hand and thank her for giving them the lives they had lived, and Margaret would say she had only done what anyone would do, and they would shake their heads and say, "No, ma'am, not anyone, and not everyone, and we know the difference because we were there." Colonel William Harrison, who had recommended her for the Silver Star, became a general after the war, and he gave a speech at Margaret's retirement. party in 1976, and he said that in all his years of military service he had never seen a more perfect example of courage and initiative than what Margaret Sullivan had shown on that night in February 1945, and he said that she represented everything that was best about America and about the people who had won the war, and Margaret cried and said she was just a nurse who had found some papers and done her job. Margaret Ann Sullivan died in Philadelphia in 2003 at the age of 86. Funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including the surviving members of the battalion she had saved and their children and grandchildren and the hospital where she had worked flew the flag at half-staff, and the local newspaper ran a front page obituary that told the story of what she had done in Julich, and people who had known her their whole lives discovered for the first time that this quiet, modest woman had been a genuine hero. Her silver star is now displayed at the Army Nurse Corps Museum in Fort Sam, Houston, Texas, alongside her photograph and a copy of the citation, and visitors can read about what she did and try to imagine what it must have been like to drive through an artillery barrage with documents that could save 800 lives, and some of them leave flowers, and some of them leave notes, and some of them are nurses themselves who see in Margaret Sullivan an example of what their profession can be at its finest. She was asked once in an interview what she had been thinking during those 6 hours when she discovered the documents and drove them to headquarters, and she said, "Honestly, I wasn't thinking about being brave or being a hero. I was thinking about all those boys who were going to die if I didn't do something, and I was thinking about their mothers and their wives and their children who would get telegrams saying their loved ones weren't coming home, and I thought, if there's anything I can do to prevent that, then I have to do it, and that's all." And that is the legacy of Margaret Ann Sullivan, the woman who never fired a bullet but saved an entire battalion because she understood that courage is not about weapons but about doing what must be done when everything is on the line.